At some point in time, I think we could reach that point, and that's when it really begins to count as far as the U.S. is concerned, that you can't run budget deficits of 6% of GDP every year and have a current account deficit, which is 3 or 4% of GDP a year. A twin deficit of 10% of GDP a year, at some point in time, maybe much sooner than we think, that will begin to count.
Rashid, there's a follow-on question, I think, to when do investors stop funding the deficit, which is if they're not putting the money into U.S. Treasuries, where are they putting the money? If you look around the world right now, some prospects, such as China, for example, does not seem to be as attractive a place for foreign direct investment. So where does the money go if it doesn't come into U.S. Treasuries?
Well, that's what's really helping the U.S., that it continues to be perceived as the best house in a bad neighborhood, right? Because you got, in terms of China in trouble, Europe, the perennial problem child of the global economy. It's like it's the first country to sort of enter a recession, possibly even in this cycle. So I think that you're seeing some other signs of life in other places, like Japan is doing much better. It's done much better this year. I think some of the emerging markets outside of China have done relatively well. These include places like India, include places like Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and even some places in Eastern Europe like Greece and even Poland. These countries have done well. Still relatively small to absorb too much capital, but you can see that this sort of new era is beginning. It takes a while, for this to happen. But I think that there will be a time, I think soon this decade, when you'll see a much better environment for international investing because the dollar stops appreciating. Currently, the dollar keeps reacting to the fact that yields are going higher. So it's like, okay, we must bid the dollar higher. Having said that, it's quite interesting that even though the perception is that the dollar is appreciating, compared to the increase in yields that's taken place, the dollar hasn't gone up that much this time. The dollar is still well below the highs it hit in September, October of last year, if you look at the DXY.
When investors start to look for other places to put the money, as you say, for example, India, Japan, Indonesia, places like that, often you get into geopolitical questions. Not so much in Japan, but certainly Vietnam is an example where that's true. And India, we've talked about before, is motivated together, as it were, to make India a more attractive place for foreign direct investment. In the past, you've expressed listed some questions about that.
Yeah, I think like in India's case, the entire issue is that there's still a very strong socialist DNA, no matter which government is in power. Having said that, in India, we've seen some pretty significant revolutions that have taken place. The entire digital revolution that's taken place in India, I think that's very significant in terms of how it's benefiting people out there and how even the welfare programs are now reaching the people in a more significant way. And just the fact that India, in terms of currently, is seen as the one large emerging market where you can hedge your bet rather than be in China, sort of really helps India a lot out here. The only issue with India, but this has always been an issue, is that it's the most expensive market in the world just now. If we fret about the multiples of the U.S. market being high, India is at a 20% premium to even the U.S. market, which is arguably the most expensive market in the developed world. So I think that the only issue is that expectations out of India are very high, but the fundamental Indian story, driven by digitization, demographics, and geography, I think is still very strong.
Rashid, it's always so good to have you with us. Thank you so much. That's Rashid Sharma of Rockefeller International. Coming up, sometimes it's not just the other side you have to worry about. The bullets may be coming from your own troops. This is Wall Street Week on Bloomberg.
World markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg 1130. Now, a global news update. President Joe Biden says the government never should have been in the position in the first place as Congress passes a federal funding bill just hours before a midnight deadline. Biden slammed some House Republicans for what he calls a manufactured crisis. He also criticizes what was passed for not adding new funding for Ukraine. General Motors has now laid off more than 160 union workers at 2 plants in Ohio as the United Auto Workers strike grows bigger. GM says in a statement beginning Monday a portion of the 2 plants won't have any work available and that laid-off workers aren't expected to return until the strike is over. This after the UAW expanded its strike Friday to more plants. Temperature records that have stood for more than a century in the middle of the U.S. could fall this week. Forecasters say an October heat wave will hit the Midwest, bringing afternoon highs in places like Fargo and Des Moines 10 to 20 degrees warmer than average, threatening daily records set back in the 1800s. I'm Scott Carr. Now, your 3-day weather forecast on Bloomberg 1130.
We've got that coastal flood advisory, vestiges of storm, still in effect until 1 p.m. for southern Queens and southern Nassau County, and also till 3 p.m. for Westchester County and southern Connecticut. Today, sunshine, high near 75 tonight, clear, low 60 to 65 tomorrow. Sunny, 75 to 80, clear again tomorrow night, low near 60. Tuesday, lots of sunshine, high near 80. And that's your Bloomberg 3-day weather forecast. I'm Denise Pellegrini. This is Bloomberg.
Missed your favorite show on Bloomberg 1130? Bloomberg Business Week, Masters in Business, Bloomberg Intelligence, and more are also available as podcasts. Listen today on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
Western One Sports presents this special report on the 44th Ryder Cup, sponsored by Prevagen. Prevagen is the most recommended memory support brand by pharmacists. With a lead of 10.5 to 5.5, Europe needing only 4 points today in the 12 singles matches to win. And European captain Luke Donald stacked his lineup. Heavy hitters went out early. The strategy paying off. Victor Hovland played the second match. Won 3 of the first 6 holes. Went on to beat Colin Morikawa 4-3, and that got Europe to 11.5 points. And John Rahm played the first match, a back-and-forth match with Scotty Scheffler, 2 of the top 3 ranked golfers in the world. It was fitting that Rahm won 18 and the match ended a tie. So half a point, getting Europe right now to 12. They'll almost certainly get a win from Rory McIlroy. 3 up with 3 to play against Sam Burns. That would get Europe to 13. Tyrell Hatton is 3 up to 13 on Brian Harman. That would get them to 14, and they would need only another half a point. John Stashower with Western One Sports.
Your brain is an amazing thing, but as you get older, it naturally begins to change, causing a lack of sharpness or even trouble with recall. Thankfully, the breakthrough in Prevagen helps your brain and actually improves memory. The secret is an ingredient originally discovered in jellyfish. Based on a clinical study of subgroups of individuals who are cognitively normal or mildly impaired, Prevagen has been shown to improve memory. A Pharmacy Times national survey of pharmacists rated Prevagen the #1 pharmacist-recommended memory support brand for the 5th year in a row. You can find it in the vitamin aisle in stores everywhere without a prescription. Help your memory. Try Prevagen today. Prevagen. Healthier brain, better life. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Now, a sports update on Bloomberg 1130.
At the Ryder Cup, John Rahm and Scotty Scheffler have halved. Meanwhile, Victor Hovland defeated Colin Morikawa 4-3. The Ryder Cup right now is 12-6 in favor of Europe. 14.5 points needed to win. This morning in London, the Jacksonville Jaguars are facing the Atlanta Falcons. Tonight at MetLife, the Jets host Kansas City. That's your Bloomberg Sports. I'm Seth Everett.
The global leader in business and financial news is now live on YouTube.
For our audience worldwide, this is Bloomberg Surveillance.
Watch Bloomberg Radio all day.
This is a market that's much more bullish.
For market news, conversation, and insight from Bloomberg's signature radio shows, Surveillance, Markets, Sound On, and Business Week.
Who's got a rally in stock?
More breaking news today from the Supreme Court. Bloomberg Radio. Watch us every business day, live on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Global News. Bloomberg Radio. Context changes everything. This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week with David Weston from Bloomberg Radio.
We asked our international economics and policy correspondent Michael McKee to look back at other times when the government moved to shut down and what the consequences were.
Mr. Hookeiser was worried about the fight over a $695 billion budget. The budget they're fighting over up on Capitol Hill today is $6.9 trillion, 10 times bigger. Does that worry Wall Street? Well, not so much. Shutdowns have become an almost regular thing, with 20 since 1977. Most of them have lasted only a couple of days, but even the two longest in 1995 and 2018 produced only a yawn in the markets, a brief dip, and then a gain for stocks. So you might well ask, what's one more? And you'd be right, unless, well, here's what could go wrong. First, analysts say this shutdown could last a lot longer. It's not a fight between Democrats and Republicans, but between Republicans and Republicans first. Until they can agree, they can't even begin to fight with Democrats. While the government is in what the Congressional Budget Office euphemistically calls a funding gap, roughly 3 million federal workers won't be paid. Many of them, including more than 1 million servicemen and women, will still have to work, but for free. Normally, it's a problem for those workers that is solved when the shutdown ends and they get back pay. But if this goes on for a month or so, it will affect consumer spending. While so far, shutdowns have not hurt overall confidence in the economy, a long one might just do that. You can't see any of the other prior incidents in GDP, but there's a recession risk in a fragile economy these days. Also, a short shutdown won't affect the Fed, which will be open, but a long one, although the economic data for September have been collected, the numbers can't be released if no one is there to release them. We may not have data on jobs or inflation before the next Fed meeting on November 1st. Even worse, if the shutdown were to last through October, or God forbid November, a lot of data won't even be collected. Or, as one observer put it, how do you achieve a soft landing if the pilots are blind? David?
Thanks to Bloomberg's Michael McKee. Friendly fire would hurt just as bad as enemy fire. So wrote Tom Clancy in his novel, Locked On. And history has plenty of examples, like Robert E. Lee losing his best general, Stonewall Jackson, shot by his own troops when returning to his lines after a nighttime reconnaissance mission during the Battle of Chancellorsville. And who can forget when someone at Citi mistakenly sent $900 million to Revlon creditors and spent years suing to get it back? This week, we had two more examples of just how painful friendly fire can be. The Canadian Parliament invited President Zelensky of Ukraine to Ottawa to speak in its august chamber. And the Speaker of the House of Commons took the occasion to honor a constituent, a 98-year-old from Ukraine who had become a Canadian citizen, someone the Speaker termed a hero of both Ukraine and Canada. Unfortunately, he turned out to have been a hero for the wrong side, having served in a Nazi SS unit in World War II. The leader of the opposition blamed Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
Prime Minister is responsible. He is in Ottawa today. He can get on his feet and answer for his massive diplomatic embarrassment and shame.
And the Prime Minister duly apologized.
The Speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians.
Turning what should have been an important and uplifting moment for a Prime Minister who, after all, has other problems to address, into something far from what he wanted it to be. And then there's the case of the United States Senator keeping his savings at home. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer already had his hands full, what with trying to keep the government funded and trying to hold on to his very slim Democratic majority. But this week, the Majority Leader learned that one of the senior members of his team, Senator Robert Menendez of New Jersey, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, had been caught with $486,000 in cash, along with some gold bars, in his house, with the cash stuffed into various items of his clothing. Senator Menendez was promptly indicted for bribery, leading his own Democratic colleagues to call for him to step down, though Senator Menendez doesn't seem inclined to take their advice. But as we learned...
You know, it's never about the goal. Whatever helps you sleep at night, sweetheart.
That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. If you missed any part of today's program, you can listen on demand with our Wall Street Week podcast. Find that on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you get your podcasts. I'm David Weston. Stay with us. Today's top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.
From the financial capital of the world, broadcasting across the globe, this is WBDR New York, Bloomberg 1130. Now, a global news update. A government shutdown has been avoided. with President Biden's signature on a funding bill last night that'll fund the government for another 45 days. The government was set to run out of money at midnight. Tammy Trujillo has more.
The bill will keep the government funded at current levels through November 17. It passed in the Senate by a vote of 88-9 after passing in the House 335-91 with overwhelming Democratic support, while dozens of Republicans voted against it. The bill includes natural disaster aid and a measure to keep the FAA operational, but it doesn't provide additional funds for Ukraine or border security.
Following Friday's decision by the United Auto Workers to expand its strike to more plants, General Motors has laid off more than 160 union workers at 2 plants in Ohio, while more than 75,000 Kaiser Permanente workers are getting set to go on what would be the biggest healthcare strike in U.S. history. Unions representing the workers notified the company over a week ago they could launch a 3-day strike starting this coming Wednesday. Negotiations are stalled on talks over pay, outsourcing, and staffing levels. In central Illinois, 5 are dead and hundreds have had to be evacuated after a semi carrying 7,000 gallons of ammonia crashed and overturned. Jim Forbes has details.
Authorities say the tanker was involved in a multi-vehicle accident late Friday night on U.S. Highway 40 near the town of Teutopolis in central Illinois. 5 people were killed and 5 were airlifted to hospitals. Thousands of gallons of toxic ammonia was spilled in the crash, forcing the evacuation of about 500 people in the area. Federal authorities are now investigating the crash.
And temperature records that have stood for over a century may fall this coming week in the middle of the U.S., as forecasters say dozens of places could break daily heat records, including Des Moines and Fargo, with expected afternoon highs 10 to 20 degrees warmer than average. I'm Scott Carr. Justice Department Special Counsel Jack Smith continues to push for a gag order against former President Donald Trump, limiting what Trump could say publicly about the ongoing criminal cases against him. Smith had initially asked for a limited gag order, but updated his request Friday, citing recent threats Trump has made against witnesses. In his request, Smith argues no other criminal defendant would be permitted to make such inflammatory public statements. Last week, Trump said former Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley had committed treason and should be executed. The NFL's going international for the first time this season. Dina Kodiak reports the Falcons and Jaguars start an international series at 9:30 Eastern Time this morning in London.
The Atlanta Falcons are set to take on the